Hello, my name is Jason Hudson, and I am the Core Regulatory Project Manager for the Port of Corpus Christi Authority's Channel Deepening EIS. I will present to you an overview of the Core EIS process and the results of our early scoping for the Channel Deepening EIS. The objectives of my presentation are to provide you an overview of the relevant laws, introduce the Core project team, and describe some of the content of the EIS, as well as some of the alternatives and environmental concerns that have been identified. The Port Authority's permit application is subject to Sections 10 and 14 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, Section 103 of the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act, Title 41 of the Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or FAST Act, and Executive Order 13807. The project must also be coordinated with state and federal agencies pursuant to Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act. Title 41 of FAST, often referred to as FAST 41, standardizes interagency consultation and coordination practices and requires that a schedule for these practices be established and published on the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council Permit Performance website. Executive Order 13807 requires federal agencies to process environmental reviews and authorization decisions for major infrastructure projects as one federal decision. That means that all federal agencies with review responsibilities for major infrastructure projects must develop a single EIS and sign a single record of decision, or ROD. The EIS team is comprised of the Corps as the lead federal agency, with the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as cooperating agencies in the development of the EIS. Several state agencies, including the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Texas Historical Commission, and Texas General Land Office, are also participating or commenting on the development of the EIS. The environmental impact statement contractor is Freeze and Nichols Incorporated, and the applicant is the Port of Corpus Christi Authority. Due to limited resources, the Core Regulatory Program utilizes a third-party contractor process to develop an EIS. In this process, the lead federal agency, applicant, and environmental consultant enter into an agreement where the applicant contracts and pays for the environmental consultant who prepares the EIS under the direction of the Corps. As you can see in the diagram, the Corps directs the environmental consultant on the development of the EIS independent of the applicant. It's important to emphasize that ultimately, the Corps is responsible for the development and content of the EIS. Here we have a timeline of major milestones for this project. The Port Authority submitted their application on January 7th of 2019, and the Corps concluded an EIS would be required in March. Subsequent to that, the project was designated a FAST 41 project in June of 2019, and initial public notice was published in August. After coordinating with the cooperating agencies, the Corps developed a purpose and need for the project in March of 2020, which we will discuss later in the presentation. The notice of intent to develop the EIS was published in April of 2020. The draft EIS is scheduled to be provided to the public in March of 2021, with a public hearing and comment period in March and April of the same year. The final EIS is scheduled to be provided to the public in January of 2022, followed by a permit decision, which will be documented in a record of decision in April of 2022. This EIS flowchart shows the sequential process for developing and publishing an EIS. We are currently in the scoping stage of the EIS, where we are soliciting your input. The information and issues identified during scoping, along with the information and issues provided in letters sent in response to the public notice, and all other pertinent data, will be considered in the determination of the scope of the EIS and the subsequent permit decision, which is documented in a record of decision. The scoping process is an integral step in the development of an EIS with the overall goal of defining the scope of issues to be addressed in depth in the analysis. The scoping process helps the Corps identify people and organizations that may be affected or have interest in the project, as well as identifying the roles and responsibilities of state and federal agencies. The scoping process also helps identify significant issues that may have not already been identified, as well as eliminate issues that will not be significant or have already been addressed. The scoping process can also aid the identification in gaps in data and information, as well as identify related studies that may be applicable. Listed here are the typical sections of an EIS. The first chapter will provide an introduction to the project and the Corps' stated purpose and need for the project. The second chapter describes the alternatives to the applicant's proposed project, and the subsequent chapters assess the impacts of all of the alternatives evaluated. The assessments will cover a wide range of environmental impacts, including the cumulative impacts. In addition, studies that support the analysis will be provided in the appendices of the EIS. This may include, but not limited to, ocean dredged material disposal site analysis, Endangered Species Act assessments, cultural resource studies, hydrology and hydraulic studies, as well as compensatory mitigation plans. The Corps is required by regulation to restate the purpose for the project from the public interest perspective. The Corps, after coordinating with cooperating agencies, developed two purpose statements, a basic purpose and an overall purpose. The basic purpose is developed to determine if a project requires siting in or proximity to a special aquatic site, such as wetlands and seagrasses. Based on the Corps' basic project purpose shown here, the project was determined not to require siting in or proximity to a special aquatic site, such as wetlands and seagrasses. Therefore, it is presumed that an alternative that does not affect special aquatic sites is available. The overall purpose is developed to identify and screen alternatives to the applicant's proposed project. The Corps has determined that the overall project purpose, from the public interest perspective, is to safely, efficiently, and economically export current and forecasted crude oil inventories via very large crude carriers, a common vessel in the world fleet. Crude oil is delivered via a pipeline from the Eagle Ford and Permian basins to multiple locations at the Port of Corpus Christi. Crude oil inventories exported at the Port of Corpus Christi have increased from 280,000 barrels per day in 2017 to 1,650,000 barrels in January of 2020, with forecasts increasing to 4,500,000 barrels per day by 2030. Current facilities require vessel lightering to fully load a VLCC, which increases cost and affects safety. Alternatives that were identified during the initial public notice, which is an early scoping step, include the no action alternative, which in this case would be permit denial, the applicant's preferred alternative, as well as alternatives to the deepening of the channel, such as a deepwater port facility. It is not uncommon in complex projects such as this one to have alternatives developed for subcomponents of the project. In this case, alternatives to the proposed dredge material placement options, such as offshore disposal, beneficial use, and upland placement. In addition to the alternatives that were identified during the public notice, several environmental concerns were raised. Many of the comments received focused on impacts to wetlands and seagrasses, as well as threatened and endangered species. Additional comments were received on navigation safety and recreational use of the area. I thank you for your interest in the development of the EIS for the Port of Corpus Christi Authority's Channel Deepening Project. I look forward to receiving your comments and suggestions. We will be accepting scoping comments through July 3rd of 2020. If you would like to submit written comments, you may do so at the mailing address or electronic email address shown on your screen.